All right, we're officially live. This is Chris from History Dose. I do all the
And this is Joe from History
writing.
Dose.
Yep, Joe is the artist, editor, and does the music, and also my brother. And I am Chris. I do all the research, the writing, narrating. My voice sounds better in the videos, so go full video voice. Welcome to the Inca Empire.
Yeah, how are our voices? Because I was just trying to figure out the audio levels ahead of time. So let us know if we're blaring or if we're too soft or if I'm softer than Chris. But everything should be equal between us now. It's same settings.
Remember, our vlogging through history interview. The audio sucks on that one.
Yeah, it's not very good. But like vlogging is coming through as super crisp and clear, and it makes us look so unprofessional. Like we just stumbled off the street with an iPhone.
Awesome. Okay. Vlogging was like immaculate, and we were like the first live stream. It was like a 2008 live stream level versus him. Okay, let me quickly. Aaron Clark says best books you use for sources. I would say not necessarily for the conquest, but an overview of the Incas, what we know about them, and the archaeology and their language and belief system. It's called The Incas by Terence Dialtroy. And that, I think it's 2014 is the second edition. That's the one I used.
Also, great profile photo.
All right, so let me get this kicked up. I'll show you a little bit what we're going to do today. Rundown of today's show. I'll give a shout out to the Patreon folks. That's right. That should be right in the description. And then I have an archaeological site that I want to show you guys. It's really cool. Any questions that we have from Patreon or Discord, or there's some other questions that came in. I think one from the Instagram, so we can do that. And then
I'm gonna let the Discord know that we're live right now.
Nice. And then we have some art. So a lot of times, if this is one of your first live streams with us, we will go a deep dive into some of the art that we did. Not necessarily super exhaustive, but just letting you know, okay, there were some paintings that Joe made, digital paintings, and there's hyper-specific details that nobody ever noticed and nobody would notice, but the only people that notice are the people we tell about it on the live stream. So you'll see some cool details. And then I didn't necessarily pick out specific comments, but there are some bad comments out there. 99.5% of the comments are pretty positive on the video. And then you have some people get hot and bothered every time you talk about conquest or clashes of cultures. They pick a side. You pick a side with, you pick a side with all the people that lived 500 years ago and feel very beholden to defending them. All right, so let me get into it. A quick shout out to the Patreon supporters, all the Patreon supporters, especially our upper tiers, the people of the con tier, Benissimo and Kevin Lee.
Just broke.
And this is what the Patreon's for, is buying Joe a new chair because he just broke it.
Yeah.
And then the leader tier, we have Nicholas Zeiler and Omri. If you want to support what we do, again, you'll see a ton of the work that we put into it today with the art that Joe makes and all of the research. If you want to support what we do, just join the Patreon. I put a link right in the description. You can join for $1. You get access to the Discord. You can talk to us.
And then there's a full history dose. Oh, sorry. There's a full history dose experience that if you're not on the Patreon, you kind of miss out on. Like, our videos are the bread and butter, obviously, but there's a bunch of other videos we have too. Other videos that expand on the initial videos, a whole playlist of them, art breakdowns, and of course, like Chris was saying, access to the Discord, early art releases. So it's the full experience, history dose experience, if you become a loyal patron of ours.
Yeah. Saludos desde Peru. Buenos videos. Okay, awesome. We're getting a little bit of an international crowd. Okay, so let's jump into it. Questions throughout the show. Feel free to throw stuff in the live chat. Priority will be given to super chats, and it will keep us fed. Buy Joe a new chair, maybe. And yeah, even if I don't answer it right away, the software that I'm using, I can like bookmark it and come back to it later. So don't feel discouraged if your question isn't answered right away. Hopefully we'll get to it. Yeah, this was the first, this was the archaeology thing I was telling you guys about, which was really cool. This is Vilcabamba and Vitkos. So if you remember from the conquest video, there's at one point the Spanish conquer the Inca Empire in 1532, and they kind of have their own puppet emperor, Manco Inca. And then he rises up in 1536, and they do pretty well. But eventually the siege of Cusco is broken, and there's enough Spaniards coming and the Spaniards' indigenous allies that they just realize they're not going to be able to stop them. So they break the siege of Cusco. The Incas leave Manco Inca and they retreat into the forest. So this is like, according to some people, it's part of the Amazon. It's right on the edge of the Amazon, but it's really cool. So there are these old Inca ruins in the jungle. So I think for a while we had, researchers had known where Vitkos was, but the cooler capital that was a bit more decked out and became their legit capital of what was called the Neo-Inca states, kind of like the exiled royal dynasty of the Incas still ruling, and they still have some part of an army, and they're launching guerrilla warfare on the Spaniards. We didn't know where that was until relatively recently, I think in the last couple of decades. And researchers had kind of like paired up accounts of where it was. So a lot of these ruins that you see here, I just included some pictures. I mean, you can see you have this huge jungle that you need to get through. So when you have these Spaniards, you have Gonzalo Pizarro launching a raid in 1539, I think. He needs to lead 300 Spaniards and a few thousand indigenous allies through this super thick jungle. So you might imagine you have that armor on and you're in the middle of this damp rainforest, and there's waterfalls and mosquitoes giving you all sorts of diseases, and you kind of don't know where you're going. You're hoping your guides know exactly where to go, and eventually you come to these ruins. These are the ruins that they found relatively recently. You can go visit them in Peru. And it's just cool. It's like something out of Indiana Jones. You have these really old ruins of this exiled kingdom, the great Inca Empire, kind of pushed into the forest, and they are just like overgrown with vines and moss and stuff like that. So that's what I just wanted to start with. That just seemed really cool to me. One of those places where you're like, I can't even believe this is real, but I hope to go to it at some point. Let's see. One of the questions I was going to go to, we had a question come in from Instagram. You can follow us on Instagram if you want. But somebody asked, because I had this question segment up here, and then we'll get to the art. But somebody asked, did the local Mesoamerican peoples, remember the Incas aren't Mesoamerican, but we know what you mean. Local Mesoamerican peoples, such as the Incas, have slavery and forced labor as well? It's a good question. So remember, you have to remember the Incas didn't have money. They didn't have a monetary system. Now, some of the people that they conquered, for example, the Chimu, used something more akin to money, and they kind of had like a legit trading system. So for the Incas, though, there wasn't a concept of working for a wage because there was no money to be made. So I think what it's normally called is really the forced labor of the Incas is forced in the same way. It's usually called like corvée labor, where it's forced in the same way of that we are all forced to pay taxes to our government. Like you're compelled to do that if you live under the empire. And so normally it would be 2 to 3 months of service toward the state. And it could be, your tax to the state is 2 to 3 months of growing maize or potatoes and building some monument or working on the road system. But it could also be military conscription. I think it wasn't until you're about 30 that it was demanded for you to serve in the military. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of forced, but there's also no way to not have a wage, or there's no concept of free labor because you can't get paid for anything. So um, the bit of the trade-off there was that the Incas would provide for you. They didn't want epidemics throughout the countryside. They didn't pillage the countryside. But that was also it wasn't a utopia. So a number of the people that were subjugated by the Incas really resented having to send people to go do work or fight in the army of the Incas when these people have conquered you. And increasingly, really, the Incas kind of put their own religion on everybody else. So it wasn't necessarily in direct conflict with a lot of the Andean view of the world, where you have kind of spirits or vitality inhabiting a lot of mountains and elements and things like that. But the difference with the Incas is that they believe that they were children of the sun god Inti. And so you have these like tiers of God sort of, and the Incas mostly revere Inti, the sun god. They hold Viracocha to be the creator. And Pachacama is also sometimes conflated with the creator. But basically, one of the interesting things is after the Spanish conquest, the worship of the sun kind of disappears from the various subjects of the Inca population, of the Inca Empire, because they had always had sort of these local beliefs where you revere a local idol or some form of like ancestor worship. And they had kind of seen, and it was the worship of the sun and the worship of this, I guess, royal lineage that's descended from the sun. That is an imperial cult that's kind of been imposed upon us. So like as soon as the Incas were de facto toppled, most of those beliefs went away.
Chris, I don't know if it ever came up in your studies on the Inca, but of course we know that both me and you and a bunch of other people have made parallels between Rome and the Inca Empire. But I'm wondering, I know the Romans, when they would take a new territory, they would always want to make sure they're on kind of they're making some spiritual compromise with the land. So if they didn't know the gods of the area, they would just erect a shrine or make an offering to, they just call the spirits of the land or the gods of the grove or something like that. Did the Inca have any idea with that too? Were they kind of henotheistic? Did they acknowledge that we might be appropriating other gods, we need to appease them? Or was it like Inti, monotheistic, this is the one god kind of deal?
No, they weren't monotheistic. So they might, I don't know, there's sometimes weird ways that we categorize things, because a lot of times other cultures will kind of have one monotheistic god and all of the other gods are kind of what we would think of as titans. You know, in the same way that like when you say Thor shares almost no qualities with like a divine original cause creator. But broadly speaking, the Andean view of the world really strongly rested on some idea of reciprocity. And that still exists in the Andes today. There's kind of some expectation that if you do something for your neighbor, you don't need to say it, but they will one day do something for you. So when people would, even between local communities, if somebody was away for their 2 to 3 months of military service, their neighbors would fill in and harvest their crops for them. And it would just be expected that that person might give you something someday. So that extended in a kind of metaphysical way as well, where you should treat kind of the villages and idols and lands with some amount of respect, or else natural disasters and things could come back to you, because it's almost like a more material form of karma, where something could happen to you if you upset some local spirits, or they call it like vitality that existed within things. And so that's how the Incas governed too, is that they felt like when they conquered you, you owe us however many months of work or military service, and in return, you now no longer need to worry about the constant raiding warfare of the Andes, and we will give you food in times of trouble, and will allow your officials to use the official highway system and stuff like that. But yeah, here we go. Let me jump right into the art here. I'm taking note of some of these questions. Good question. What are you drinking, Joe?
Every afternoon, I fill up a glass about this high with whiskey, and it's coffee. It's iced coffee.
All right. So I have some cool art here. So these are a selection of digital paintings that Joe made. I'd say they normally take like 3 to 5 hours.
Depends on the piece, but yeah, average.
Yeah. So I compiled an enormous document. I think it's like 150 pages, but it had everything from like most likely helmets that the conquistadors wore to this was the layout of these specific forts, or these are 80 different plausible pattern references that we have for Inca tunics, and everything, every possible thing you could think of, whatever the animal is, the textile, every single kind of weapon. I wanted it to just be like a repository so I could ask Joe, can you give me a painting that looks like this? And we'll have the army. And then he wouldn't need to come back to me and ask, what do their helmets look like? Or what's this? Because he has every single reference right there. So this was this was the opening image of the video. Need to start with some excitement. And this is actually flashing forward in the beginning of the video to the Great Inca Revolt of 1536. The interesting thing is that this is actually the Incas burning their own city. They are burning Cusco because the Spanish have had control of Cusco for about 3.5 years, 4 years at this point. And so now you have about 200 Spaniards and their allies kind of pinned down within this big, great city of Cusco, their former capital. And the Incas, tens of thousands of them, have rushed in and pushed them back to a few positions. And, armor and steel weapons are a huge game changer. There's sometimes people who overrate them, but I think you also can't underrate them. And so, like, it's really hard if you just have rocks and bronze weapons to finally get a kill on someone who's kind of like barricaded in a building, and he has a steel helmet and a crossbow and a steel breastplate. Has it been confirmed that Inca rode llamas into battle? No, yeah, you can't. You cannot ride llamas. They don't want you on there. And actually, one of the interesting things, that was a fun little detour, but one of the interesting things is that you'll see in our paintings as well, when the Incas are marching, they have a lot of porters, like people that are physically carrying these big jars and huge packages or supplies for the army. And at first you think, well, there's llamas right there. Why aren't the llamas carrying those? It's because and it was found out pretty quickly by the Spaniards, and the Incas knew this well. Llamas, unlike horses or mules or donkeys, they have like a breaking point where they literally will no longer carry your stuff. It'll be like however many miles, and at a certain point they will lay down. I'm sure they tried to whip them and get them going. No, they will not move. They're done. They're done caring for you. So a certain amount of the Inca army was always humans carrying stuff, and the llamas can help out here and there. But you're definitely not riding one into battle. Okay, so the interesting thing about this, though, is that they are burning their own city. Most of Cusco is made of stone. All those big walls and the constructions are made of stone, except for the roofs that are straw. So the tiny detail that nobody would notice is that they are burning their own roofs. And how they did that was, you can see these slingers, people throwing heated rocks that were wrapped in a cloth. And then they would toss those onto the roofs and just kind of burn the whole city, meant to flush the Spaniards out and ruin whatever kind of small refuge that they could find. Yep, this is Inca slingers, heated sling stones. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I beat you to it. Yeah, this is in the video. I don't think anybody noticed this. You kind of have to zoom in, but
yeah,
it's just a cool thing. I mean, why do we put this stuff in? It's partially it's fun to share with people, but the other aspect, yeah, and we like when we are reading about these events, and I think we want you guys to feel the same way when you're watching History Dose, is that you want to see History Dose cover something and I want to see Joe illustrate something and do all the research because I want to see what it looked like. I want to see how enormous or cataclysmic the siege of Cusco was. But yeah, let me see here. Okay. This is the Battle of Cajamarca. So there's a lot going on here, but this is the part where the Spaniards surprise attack Atahualpa and they capture him. And that kind of allows them to avoid a lot of the combat later on, is that they ambush these people. A number of the Incas in that battle were lightly armed because they know there's 168 Spaniards. You have several thousand people. What's the real risk here? And then all of a sudden, armored people on the backs of horses are rushing you and kind of causing a panic and cutting your limbs off and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the cool detail here, you can see the pattern on this is called the unku. These were the tunics that the Inca wore. So this was a book late 1500s or early 1600s by that had cataloged a bunch of like the Inca lineage, but you can see the pattern is taking directly from that. So a lot of the patterns that you see in the textiles are not Joe shields. Just making something up, but these are surviving things or stuff that is attested to in the sources. So that was a tiny little detail. I'm sure we could dissect this painting for hours, but this I didn't have a ton to say about, but this was a kind of a cool moment when you have all of the Inca subjects answering the call of Manco Inca. There were some people in the comments that were like, wow, like 100,000 people. How did they get 100,000 people into this siege? But I mean, it is recognized by scholars. So we have sources from the time that are giving you figures of 100,000 to 200,000 plus for the Inca troops during the Great Revolt. But scholars generally see that it is reasonable for the Incas at times throughout their imperial history to have had fielded armies of 100,000 effective soldiers at any one time. So when you have something like this, it does the 100,000. I don't know if I bought the 200,000, so I listed 100,000 in the video, but it's conceivable that they could have done that. They had an empire of 10 million subjects. And around this time, you have Pizarro saying the entire country is in rebellion. So after months of gathering troops, does it seem plausible to me that you could have had 100,000 people, maybe not necessarily the most organized, but you ended up getting 100,000 people around Cusco? Yeah, that makes sense to me. That seems like a figure that could work. And we even know like the Spaniards themselves had just departed, Almagro had just departed for Chile with 12,000 Inca troops. And that was just, he was just able to marshal that along his 500 Spaniards. So do I think that, Manco Inca, the actual Inca emperor with a few months prep, could he get like 8 times that? Yeah, it seems to make sense to me. So yeah, you have this huge army and you have your generals overhead using the conch shell to rally the troops. That was just, I don't know, it was almost like a Mongol style painting that we had. This was the one I was like, Joe, don't put too much detail on it because I don't want to get in trouble here in terms of gore. But yeah, this was I don't know how many people caught it in the video, but I tried to be a bit clever. I was like, some parts of the rescue mission did arrive in Cusco months after Pizarro had sent some rescue mission to Cusco. Those parts are just their heads, obviously. So the Incas, General Quiso had sent a sack full of 5 heads to Manco Inca as like the reward. And the Incas decided we're going to basically greatly demoralize the Spaniards by saying, hey, these are the people that were sent to rescue you. Here's heads. So here are the sacks. Here's the sack of heads on the road.
You can kind of make out
Spaniards.
One poking out there.
Yeah.
And then a slight suggestion of the ripped up letters kind of falling out. But I just thought that would be a terrifying visual. Was when Chris like proposed the scene to me, I was like, okay, everyone knows I love the movie The Northman. I was like, there's that scene in The Northman where Amleth is up on the hill and says that he has the heart of Fulnir's son. And so the insinuation is his son will never be able to rest or might become a Draugr or something if he doesn't get the heart back. And so Amleth is up there giving his speech with his son's heart about like vengeance. And it's like, the composition looks very similar to this. I pretty much was like, I want something similar to that, like this intimidating figure you're looking up at, and he has something kind of grisly. So when Chris proposed this, I'm like, okay, I know directly what the inspiration is going to be. And so when we cut to this, it's like I started putting in the orchestra with like the tremolo strings and the heavy drums with a slight beat, and then Chris just says like, no, they were actually the heads, not the people that arrived. So I just thought it was a pretty like cool moment.
Yeah. Okay, so the next painting I have queued up here is something that it is attested to in the sources over and over again. I found a somewhat recent, I think in the last couple of years, a journal article kind of discussing what we think that this looked like based on descriptions. But even though all these books and secondary sources too are talking about this imperial garden of Cusco, it is a garden of llamas and llama herders and birds and other animals, and a garden of maize, and all of it is made in silver and gold. I couldn't find any images, any artist rendition, anybody trying to recreate what it looked like, only some discussions. So this was kind of fun because it was definitely one of those cases where you're like, let's go make the first depiction of this. Like the only depiction you'll find online, only depiction that we know of in any book. Here's the first artist rendition of this imperial garden. So you can see there's the fields of maize there. One of the interesting details too is the Spaniards had talked about how there were like bits of gold and silver all over the ground, and that was supposed to simulate the soil that the gold and silver maize was growing out of. We have llamas there. Joe decided to make it somewhat symmetrical. And then in terms of birds, that was just sort of like I don't know, a logical inference that I made, that they're not sitting on the ground or something. They must be like suspended on some pole because it's kind of meant to look a bit real. And they have people on the sides. and then we have a depiction of Inti, the sun god. So that is mainly taken from sculptures that we think, say something about how the Incas depicted people, but then there's some colonial era depictions of Inti.
Yeah. And another tiny little detail too, kind of hard to see because it's kind of in shadow. But our little person in the foreground is barefoot because it's my understanding, right, Chris? This was treated almost as like a sacred area,
Yeah.
and you were to remove any footwear, sandals that you have on.
Yeah. Let me see here. We got Ancient Americas. I'm going to pop in real quick and say that your Inca episodes were phenomenal. I loved watching them. Thank you.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Check out Ancient Americas, guys. It's a great channel. That's all basically pre-Columbian indigenous history, so pretty awesome. Okay, super chat coming in. Thank you, Wim. How did the Spanish resupply on gunpowder? So how that would have happened, all the resupplying would normally come through Panama. So at that time, I remember when I was just studying this, I was like, well, how did the Spanish have ships to explore the South American coast? If you come from Spain and you have to walk across Panama or Central America, and then you need to, like, you're not getting the ship across. There's no Panama Canal then. So, but they had occupied that for a while. I mean, so it had been, 1521 is when the Aztecs fall. So the Spanish are kind of like building up that infrastructure. So if they want reinforcements, a lot of them come from Panama, or the base of operations is from there. And then I think the second thing to keep in mind is that the Spanish are not using that much gunpowder. So when they arrive, you have 168 people. I think it's 8 or 9 people that have the arquebus firearms. So the arquebus firearm is not the determining factor in taking out the Incas. And I'll get to it later in the show. Technology is a big piece of it. Indigenous allies are a big piece of it. But in terms of the technology being a huge factor, it's mostly the armor and swords and stuff like that really makes them formidable in battle. The arquebus, if anything, you end up like killing a few Incas, but there's kind of a shock factor and technological advancement. But yeah, I mean, so if they are loading up, you get some reinforcements from Panama, but they're not using a ton of gunpowder every day. Let me see. Okay, so a couple of the details you can see right here. These are the llamas and alpacas. That is based on the surviving examples of their depiction of that. They basically universally look like that. It's almost like a little bit of like a Banksy vibe. But yeah, so the Spaniards, a number of the Spaniards who saw this before they fully looted Cusco and kind of melted down this imperial garden, Spaniards had visited it. 3 Spaniards visited, and then they come into Cusco in 1533. I think it's the summer of 1533 when they eventually actually reach Cusco, or maybe it's November of 1533. They reach Cusco and they sack the city. And there's a few Spaniards kind of lament the loss of this imperial garden. And then the priests, the Inca priests that serve in the temple, are kind of very dismayed. They would not go in the temple to watch what was happening. They believe that gold are the tears of the sun. So it is like, this is kind of like these sacred elements that are kind of being looted here. And so that the Spaniards end up melting down almost everything. I mean, they try to melt down everything other than a few keepsakes. So stuff like the llama to the left here, that is very tiny. It's like probably this big. And they might send that back to Spain just to kind of show some of the treasures, but normally you want that in ingots so it's standardized and you care about it for its material value, whereas the Incas care about it kind of as sort of like a spiritual metaphysical thing and it's like an artistic thing. Let's see here. How many? Okay, we got a question here. How many people are we talking about in reference to sacking the area? I'm trying to think because they had 168 people when they arrived, and then they got some reinforcements. So it's probably about, I would guess, like 280, 300 plus Spaniards, and then they have some indigenous allies with them. But generally speaking, like Cusco is not divided up among the indigenous allies. Those are buildings and things that are taken by the Spaniards and claimed. Here's a surviving example. You can see their depiction of the corn or maize tended to be a lot more naturalistic. Kind of looks real. So that's a silver piece of maize. I'll just say that there is a tiny bit of debate. Like most scholars believe that's truly Inca, and some believe it's a bit later or a different culture. But it's roughly around that Peru area. And then in terms of the people, this is generally how the Incas depicted people. They kind of have like large heads,
kind of gnomish.
Yeah, the arms tended to not be disconnected. They would be like kind of carved into the side of the torso. But I will say, like in the Andes, there was naturalism. Whether or not that's what the Incas were going for, they had their own unique style. You have, I'm always just astounded, and I showed this in the last Inca video, but the Moche civilization have like super realistic, they're called portrait vessels, and that's 100 BC to 500 AD. The Moche right on the coast there were making these things that are kind of reminiscent to kind of like the peak of Roman realism, where you can make out like tiny details in the face and stuff like that. So that is really cool. Let me see here. Question come in. How were the Spanish able to secure interpreters for their first major interactions with the Incas? So the first one that they're using, imagine like once they're in there, it's a lot easier to get a bunch of interpreters. But the first one was they had scouted the coast of South America on 2 previous voyages. In one of the places that Pizarro and Almagro sacked, they took 2 native boys. And I don't know if we know the original names of those people, but I think it was, they called one Martin, and then the other one was Felipillo. And Felipillo is the like principal. So they have them for a couple of years, and then they come back for the 1531, 1532 conquest expedition. It's by capturing those boys, though, that they know that Huayna Capac was the emperor when they first landed there, or on that second expedition when they landed there. So that's one of the ways that we can date the death of the last Inca emperor before Spanish contact, basically, was Huayna Capac. It's around 1528. Another cool thing, and I talk about it in the bonus episode for the Patreon, but there are accounts of comets coming before Huayna Capac's death, and some researchers have determined that a comet passed overhead Peru in January of 1528. So even though we don't have any real Spanish records or written records of when Huayna Capac died, that was kind of like a really cool way that they were able to figure out with some level of confidence when Huayna Capac dies, and then the Civil War starts shortly after that. Thank you guys for the questions. I'm gonna keep moving along here, but I'll have I'm bookmarking some of these so I can get back to your questions. Let me, what do I have up next here? I didn't go. I won't go into too much detail of this, but this is Saksai Waman. The big. It's kind of a fortification, kind of a religious temple for the Incas, but definitely during the siege of Cusco, the Incas are using it more as a fortification. So it's kind of I believe it's like northern Cusco, and it's this big terraced structure, and we included some pictures of it in our videos, but you can see, I mean, look up Saksai Waman, you will see the most enormous stones that seem like there's no way that somebody moved those into place or cut it so that it was perfectly flush against the other stone. And it's kind of like a terrace hill on top of that. So the Incas during the siege are using this as like a base of operations. They can see over the on top from they can see all around the city, and it's a fortified place. And to get to each level, there's a gate. The Spaniards, I believe, make it through that first gate, so they're on that first terrace, just through brute fighting. And they have a few hundred indigenous allies, but by some accounts, there are 20,000 to 30,000 Incas in the fortification. Even if we want to say that's an exaggeration, let's call it 10,000. Like it's 10,000 versus 600 people. 200 of them are Spaniards or something. So there are rocks and slings and sharp objects flying down, rattling off your steel armor. And they manage to break through that first one, and then they get pushed back. So the Juan Pizarro is leading the assault, and after that first day of fighting, he had actually gotten hit earlier in the fighting with a sling rock that like broke his jaw or something, and his jaw was so swollen that he couldn't fit his helmet on. Because he didn't have a helmet on, one of those rocks hit his skull, and he died 2 weeks later. So they're kind of pushed back. The hill that this guy is standing on, Rodadero Hill, is where the Spanish are pushed back after the first day of fighting. And then in the middle of the night after that, they end up launching an assault that takes ladders to the walls. And after a few more days, they end up succeeding in climbing the whole thing and killing everybody within. So yeah, that's another thing where like I really haven't seen any good depictions of this. I've seen some like close-up battle paintings, but these are cool to just see the scale of it for us as well. This is the thumbnail for this live stream. This is Ollantaytambo. You can look that up. It's a really beautiful place. I believe it was originally like an imperial estate or settlement. I want to say it was Pachacuti who set it up. Maybe it was Tupac Yupanqui. But you can still go there today. There's kind of like a tiny village, and you have these huge terraces on the walls. So for some of these, sometimes I'll just find an image or cool reference. And so this is supposed to be the army of Manco Inca. These like rebel forces are gathered here, and they have some of the jungle forces that are not wearing any shirts, and they're better bowmen, that you can see in the foreground there. And they're at Ollantaytambo, and this was based off of this image that I gave Joe. That I was just like, this is Ollantaytambo today, and I was like, just imagine these terraces full of these warriors that are protecting their emperor. So yeah, I mean, we get inspiration from a number of things. Sometimes a movie gives you the right tone or something.
Chris, can you guess which movie for this one?
This?
Yeah.
I thought it was just based off my image. It seems kind of like Dune.
Yeah, just Dune. Paul Atreides and Dune 2 holds up his knife, and then the whole army. So that's kind of what I was trying to evoke. You get the silhouetted guy.
Let me bring on Joel's question. He said, which Inca piece was the most challenging / rewarding to create, and why?
For this episode, probably Probably Sacsayhuaman, the siege. Just because, like, even though I have I made a version of it not being sieged for the previous episode,
Right
and that
here.
was yeah, and the one when it was in its prime, I think it was a version where it was being actively built. That was like my first version of it. You could see them like pulling up stones, and then some of the terraces that weren't finished. Now, do you have that with you, or the other,
Which one?
the original?
I don't have it on
Painting?
this one. No.
Oh, okay. Well, that one was pretty challenging, but there's also like a challenge with creating something at such a big scale, especially when it has to do with like a siege and you're dealing with thousands of people, because you need to find like a compromise between like detail and, like I said, scale. So it's like I'm not going to go in, I'm not going to detail every shield, I'm not going to detail every face, every sword, or else History Dose isn't releasing any videos this year. So um like if you zoom in on these guys, they're texture, they're all texture, some suggestion of swords and stuff. So that's always a challenge for me. But you notice it when you watch your favorite movies like Lord of the Rings. If you were to take like a section of when they're showing the Charge of the Rohirrim or something, and you just zoomed in on that when it's all zoomed out, you can't make out anything. You can make out like vaguely there are horses and stuff, but everything is, a few pixels. So it's always a challenge trying to like, how abstract can I go with the army and still make it readable, that you can understand that you're looking at a siege, you're looking at people being killed or people on horses and stuff. So I would say that was, any type of painting where there's like a ton of scale is pretty challenging. If we're talking about Inca in general, the first one, I think Cusco, the city of Cusco, was just like kind of daunting because I wanted to get all the boundaries right. And I remember when I first showed it to Chris, he was like, okay, it needs more houses, it needs more roads or something. And then there's also part of you that's like, you want it to look glorious because this is Cusco, this is going to be a big moment. So there's always like this expectation you have for yourself, like it needs to be a moment you can sit with in the video and kind of stand in awe at.
Yeah. Let me go here to the what a question. Prince of Dol Almroth, aka Lord Lancaster, from the Discord. Just got off work. How did the Incas rank compared to the other stories you've told? I mean, I'd say it's right up there. It's like it's going to be top tier. Where
top 5 at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough with like the stories. There's some stories that I think like the character is so good, like the Dumas or Harold Hardrada. It's like it's tough to beat that life, where you're just like that is one of the best lives ever lived. It's such an adventure. But in terms of like civilizations, they might be number one in terms of just like the sense of awe and wonder that you get covering the Incas. It's similar to the Guptas, where if you've never really studied them before, or maybe you didn't grow up learning a lot about ancient Indian history or South American, the great Andean civilizations, and then you start studying them, you're like, whoa, hold on, they had aqueducts, they had this, they had a system of communication with cords, and they collected an annual census of millions of people, and they had military conscription and taxation and princely titles and stuff like that. It was just, it was incredible. And then there's just so many numbers that get thrown at you where you're just like, wait, no way. Like 25,000 miles of road. That's the diameter of the earth. And it's like, yep, 25,000 miles of road. Not all of it's paved, but a lot of it, you just start to see like parallels with those great ancient civilizations that we're so fond of kind of saying like, oh, how did the Romans figure this out? How did they have a canal system or a system of irrigation and aqueducts or X, Y, and Z? And the Incas have a lot of that as well. So one of those subjects that kind of just the best thing ever, I think, is when you're reading history and something hits you that you go, you now view a certain part of the world or a certain period of time in a completely different way. That, maybe implicitly you had assumed some things about this civilization or this part of the world, and it just flips it on its head. Let me see. Brian Villafuerte. Will you make a video about the Incas during the viceregal era, 16th century and 19th century? Yeah, I think if there's interest, it's kind of why I didn't say this was the last Inca one. It is the fall of the Inca Empire, but I would like to do something on Tupac Amaru II. So that'd be like colonial era stuff, and get a sense for that because, I never want, and I did it with the end of this episode and a number of the Native American ones that we did. But I don't want it to be like, okay, now these people are done. Now their history is over. It's like, well, people assimilate or they find status in a new system or they, change their culture in this way, but preserve these traditions and they resist and stuff like that. So, these are kind of like nuanced and complex stories to tell. So I can never really accurately capture that upcoming history and like the next 3 centuries, here's what happened. It's like, well, it's very complex. So I would, if there's interest, I would make like, I don't know what we would call it, like Return of the Incas or something like that. Zero Connection. Any books you'd recommend on the Inca Empire? I think a really good overview is The Incas by Terence D'Altroy. If you want something that I think is very readable, and it covers a lot of conquest, but it also covers some of that prior history, I think The Last Days of the Incas by Kim McQuarrie is really good. That's a fun read. Okay, let me see if I had any more paintings here. Oh yeah, this was I think this was the last one I was just going to do. This bleeds into the Potosi one, Joe. So these are the helmets that you see here. There's a couple different helmets. There's the Sellet helmet that's also further to the right in the same picture. But sometimes people from far away might assume that this is like the classic conquistador Morillon helmet. And that's like kind of like the tilted up road to El Dorado, like high ridge kind of spine of the helmet. That's what you think of as the classic conquistador one. It is possible that some wore that, but this is like an earlier style of it. And this actually in the 1520s and 1530s, this would have been much more common. This is the Cabasset helmet. I'm sure I'm getting like the enunciation of that wrong. It's probably Cabasset or something, but you can see it's almost, it has some similarities with that kind of helmet. There is like a ridge through the middle and it has a similar vibe. Sometimes it's tilted, so you can see like the guy on the left. But one of the interesting details in the video is that we end up talking more and more as the decades go on, what is happening to the Inca society. And I talk about Potosi. That's the big silver mine that they find in Bolivia. And from 1545 and the century after, about half of the world's silver came from that one mountain. So it was a huge, I was going to say gold mine. Let me just say silver mine for the Spanish. And because by 1600, there's over 100,000 people that live around that mountain. And you would never think of it today. Like, what are the biggest cities in the world? Well, one of them was Potosi in 1600. And so you can see in this one, you actually have like a more classic, this is decades later. You can see the town in the distance, but you have a classic Morillon conquistador helmet because that's when it's a bit more historically accurate to actually have that. Okay. Let me get to some of your comments, some of the questions that came in through here. And then the last thing, we have some bad comments. Some of, like I said, there's like 99.5% are positive, wonderful video, life changing. And then some of the people
turn my
get,
life around.
yeah. Some of the people get angry, or they're trying to like read a political message into it. So I'll talk about those too. But let me get to these positive ones first. Your questions in here. So answered the gunpowder one. Let's see. Question for Chris. During your studies, was there some part or aspect of the Inca Empire that you could not find? Was there a question you would ask Pachacuti? Any burning unanswered questions? I would just say that some of the imperial stuff that you see from the first chunk of the Inca Empire is very muddy. So we're kind of blessed in a way, because it's a kind of like, they didn't have an official writing system, but the Incas did use quipus. So you had official historians that were keeping the royal histories alive. Now, one of the problems with that is that they keep the royal histories alive that they want to keep alive. So if there are rival rulers, or somebody co-ruled on the throne and then they were later ousted, maybe we never hear their names. One of the things that in that first Rise of the Inca videos, it's kind of piecing together a rough chronology that we can say basically happened this way. But I kind of have to word things vaguely a number of times, because there will be things like, well, one source has it that Pachacuti conquered these people. Other source said Tupac Yupanqui conquered these people, his son. It could have been Tupac Yupanqui as a general under Pachacuti, or it could have been when they co-ruled the empire together, as may have happened, but we don't necessarily know that it happened. So I would love if there was like more clarity for that you get a sense more of their personality. Like Pachacuti definitely did this, and Tupac Yupanqui definitely did this. Archaeology has made it so that we're able to kind of have a bit more confidence in when a settlement was built, or when a certain people were attacked or conquered. But I would guess, yeah, that just, if I could sit down Pachacuti, I'd be like, what year is it? Like, did you conquer them, or did your son do it? Yeah, so that's the only thing. It's like kind of, if you have Roman accounts of that, you have a bit more confidence in like, this happened this year, this happened this year. With the Incas, it is impressive how much we know. This emperor pushed into the forest and was repelled, and they conquered these people, but they did a rebellion. But if we had a bit more clarity on like chronology and stuff, that'd be nice.
Wouldn't you like more clarity on their possible seafaring trade with Polynesians as well?
Yeah, I don't know if they. I don't think that they. I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough one. There are accounts that say they met these people from the sea, where Tupac Yupanqui went over to this island. And we know genetic studies have confirmed that some South Americans, I think in present-day Colombia, did have contact and interbred with Polynesian explorers. Whether the Incas did or not, I don't know. But, if they had stayed in power, who knows if they had stayed in power another 100 years or something and kind of expanded, maybe they would have. Yeah. Let me see. Okay. Got another one coming up here. All right. Let me get to these comments that kept coming up. Here are like kind of the 3 batches of negative comments that you'll see on this video. I put it as an animation thing where these would come on one at a time, but StreamYard doesn't want that to work. So, okay. So the first thing though, we had some comments saying like, oh yeah, this is like an urban legend. The Spanish defeated millions of people just because they had armor and weapons. Like, you could say, how could that happen You have 168 people. You have an empire of 10 million people. There's no way it happens. It's a bit of a straw man because there's nowhere in the video, and nobody is claiming that, 168 Spaniards went into battle against 1.5 million Incas and left the battlefield with no.
They weren't on some giant plateau where they were meeting.
Really, how it happened, I think there's a better way to think. I'll get to this one, Jeffrey Pack. Yeah, I'm not lying about the second one. Somebody was claiming that, but I think the best way to think of the conquest of the Incas is that it's an armed coup. So the Spaniards actually don't want to go into battle against millions of people or an army of 100,000, because they would probably, on an open field, they would still die against that. It's important to remember they do have indigenous allies. There's lots of people that don't like the Incas, or people that had just been. Thomas Owens saying that too. But there were lots of people that had just been free, and then they were conquered by the Incas, or people that had allied with Atahualpa's brother in the Civil War. And now Atahualpa has captured Huáscar, and the Civil War is basically over. And Atahualpa has murdered most of the royal line, and tons of people have died in the last few years. So as soon as these people come in, and the Spaniards are aware of this, and they can fashion themselves as liberators, they join the Spanish side. Let's go get. They're happy that Atahualpa is dead. So it's tough to say, okay, well, it's definitely like an Inca versus Spanish thing. You have some recent Incas, or Incas of a different faction, that are supporting the Spaniards, not fully cognizant that the way the Spaniards are operating, that this is really a coup. So they aren't just. They will put in somebody like Manco Inca, who they will say is kind of the Huáscar faction, brother of Huáscar. But to that first point, the armor and weapons didn't defeat millions, and they didn't need to. So I'm hearing some static buzz, Joe. Are you hearing that?
I am not hearing.
Yeah, it's definitely Joe.
Wait,
when I muted him, it went away.
Wait, is it my phone? Someone was texting me. Maybe that's it.
That was probably texting during the live stream.
Is it static-ing right now? Or are we good?
No, that's good.
Okay, it was the phone. I'll keep it off the desk.
But yeah, so you capture Atahualpa. Nobody can rise up and attack you because they are subservient to Atahualpa. So Atahualpa is the you cannot defy him. So Atahualpa is telling his people to obey the Spaniards. And as soon as they execute him, you have some of Atahualpa's old loyal generals that are rebelling, but you also have the Spaniards installing puppet emperors. So one they select pretty early on, then he dies, and then they come across Manco Inca and they install him. So that's a way that you get a bunch of indigenous, you get the Incas on your side. You get a certain amount of the Inca nobility, and you get the subjects to listen to you. So most of the time, the Spaniards are avoiding direct conflict, and they are having, also these indigenous allies, a few thousands that are definitely helping them. But I think the thing to parse out there is that the indigenous allies are vital. They need other people in the field, and they need allied Incas to support them. But when you have those huge troop disparities, so like, for example, the Siege of Cusco, some of the figures given, at least at the start of the Siege of Cusco, is that you have 186, I think, Spaniards, 190 something Spaniards, a few African slaves, and 500 indigenous allies. And you have somewhere around 100,000 Incas that are besieging you. We know that's a big deal because the Spaniards tried to get out and they couldn't get out. But why? Like, why did the Spaniards not lose all of their men right away? Is it because the 500 indigenous allies were, 10 times better than the Incas? Well, no, because we know that these indigenous allies had also lost against the Incas before, because they were just in the Civil War and they lost against Atahualpa's forces. So, as much as we can say armor and weapons are not the sole reason that this happened, a lot of it is politics, a lot of it is the coup. It is also a really big deal. So, by some accounts, the Spaniards only lose 8 or 9 people during the entire siege of Cusco. It's a 10-month siege. They're getting more indigenous allies throughout the thing, but some accounts might have 30,000 by the end. But still, you have less than 200 Spaniards stuck in the city versus 100,000 Incas, and they only lose 9 people. And that's sometimes steel armor is just steel armor. If somebody is barricaded in a big fortification and they're avoiding a lot of direct conflict and they have on steel helmets and breastplates, yeah, it's going to be really hard to kill them. It's not necessarily that they killed the 100,000 attackers, but they can hold out for a lot longer. Yeah, so some of the stuff that you'll see too, that second one, somebody thought I was joking. Someone said the Inca Empire never ended. Yeah, it is the conquest of the Inca Empire. It did end here. Any scholar will say it either ended 1532 when they killed Atahualpa and installed their puppet government. Some people say, well, it kind of persisted because you had the Neo-Inca state until 1572. Yeah, and you can see Brian saying a similar thing. Okay, so we are transferring the title of Sapa Inca to the King of Spain. So in that way, the Inca Empire persists under the Spanish. I would say, like, it maybe at a certain point it's the ship of Theseus thing where you're saying, okay, well, we've replaced the Inti imperial cult, which is the basis of the line, of the imperial line. We've killed Atahualpa of the imperial line. We've killed Tupac Amaru, who was the legit heir after that, even the puppet installed. And the puppet rulers have no real power to resist the foreign invaders in kind of their attempt at, let's say, forced assimilation, encomienda system. Encomienda system kind of disappears a bit because of these Spanish reforms. But I think it's worth keeping in mind who's really in power here. Did the Incas have a choice to say, hey, the Sapa Inca's still in charge. Why don't we just have the Spaniards leave? It's like, this is a coup installing a puppet ruler. There are many Inca nobles who maintain some semblance of power or royalty in this new system. But generally speaking, this is not the emperor. This is not the empire of Pachacuti. It's not honest to say that this is the Inca Empire still going on. And, now the new Sapa Inca, the son of Inti, the sun god, is just King Philip. Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a very convincing argument, but if it makes you feel better, the Inca Empire is still alive today, I guess. And then the worst argument. This is the worst argument that you can do, especially against our channel. If you're bothered by the Spanish conquest and you say, well, look, you're saying this is brutal. They did this, this, and this. Do you know what the British or Americans or the French did in their conquest? And it's like, those actually are not connected at all. I mean, that we're not interested in in making a comparison or keeping tally marks on who's good or who's bad or which conquest was worse or not. And if you think this channel is making excuses for like British or American conquests or expansionism, you probably are not very familiar with this channel. So yeah, that is those are the worst comments you can make, but you can keep making them if you want. Let's see if we have some stuff. Any last questions here? or anything you wanted to add, Joe?
No, I guess. Well, I just had a thought, and it was so the idea of the Inca Empire falling, but you still have the Inca Empire is crumbling. You have the transference to kind of the Neo-Inca state in the jungle. I was wondering how analogous that would be to the fall of Western Rome and the persistence of Eastern Rome, and then eventually the Byzantine Empire.
If it's similar, you mean kind of having like a former state?
Yeah. Do you think it's like politically analogous?
I
feel like they're even more like the Incas were even more handicapped than Eastern Rome was after the fall of Western Rome.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is also something that keeps going on, which is similar to Rome, where you're kind of you see this with like Charlemagne, the title of Sapa Inca, is no longer the true emperor of the Inca Empire. It is not the empire of Pachacuti. It's not really the same thing anymore. But it becomes like a political thing to say. So
yeah,
you're passing this on, but you are the Sapa Inca and you live in the jungle and you live in Vilcabamba. You are not commanding all of the people of your empire anymore. And even Tupac Amaru, Tupac Amaru had submitted to the Spanish, I think about a year before his death. So he was like kind of formally, or his predecessor had formally submitted to the Spanish, where the Neo-Inca state is under Spanish authority. And then
so they didn't have the same real kind of almost independent autonomy that the Byzantine Empire would have had.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just one of those. It becomes a bit of a ceremonial title at a certain point. But I do remember the Spanish accounts, at least one of them making note of the people crying when Tupac Amaru is beheaded. And by the way, the Spanish crown is quite upset at that. The Spanish crown was normally looking for more peaceful or regular relations with the leaders of the Inca Empire as like sort of like a subject state or another sovereign king that kind of serves us. And a lot of the conquistadors were less forgiving or less peaceable in terms of that. But one of the accounts had made mention of like the wailing of the former Inca subjects or former Inca nobles when Tupac Amaru was beheaded by the Spanish. It almost seemed to include some there was a sense that something big had happened. Like, okay, Tupac Amaru is not the emperor that Pachacuti was. He doesn't command all of the same things. But to see it really die this way, to see the line actually die out like that, was a big deal to them, in the same way that it kind of is for our video. It's like that to me is like the official ending of a conquest that was more or less complete in, let's say, 1537 or something. Let me drop this in the chat though. Joe History Dose has a good number of subscribers, but Joe's separate art channel does not.
Everyone hates me.
Yeah.
No, I think it's just not a lot of people know about it. But I have a separate art channel for all you people who hate history but love the art of History Dose. So you can check it out. It's a lot of speed paintings, process videos, but also breakdowns along lines of like, how do you do this? And it's not just history stuff. It's like, do you want to learn how to make epic fantasy art? Come to my channel. I'll teach you. There's a whole video on it. Does it not register as a link in the chat?
I don't know if it does.
Oh, well, you can find me if you just search
History Dose is censoring History Dose in the chat.
Can you do an @ in the chat?
I don't think, maybe if you commented with your account, but if you look up Joseph Feely, it'll come up.
Well, there's going to be, I
Joseph
think there's
Feely
an
art.
Irish musician, and then there's me. He's kind of stealing all my traffic.
Okay, look up Joseph Feely art.
Yeah,
minus
that
musician.
might work. There's a good Irish.
But okay, let's. It seems like a wrap. I feel like we covered a lot. We answered some questions. Thank you guys for tuning in. We have a pretty interesting topic coming up. Another, I don't want to give up too much away. It's for the Patreon folks, but
hey, link works.
It's one of those topics where you're like, there's no way that happened, did it?
Yeah. So we love you, Lord Mo.
Yeah. And then you can, if you want to comment something down below and just say, I want you guys to cover. I mean, we always get these recommended video topics, but this was kind of like a civilization focused one. So if you have another civilization in mind where you're like, I want to see the rise and fall of these people, doesn't not necessarily need to be pre-Columbian. I know a lot of people want Aztecs. We want to do the Aztecs eventually, hopefully this year. But it might also be fun if you want something ancient, if you want Assyria or something like that. Yeah, and hopefully we'll get to it. This was a lot of fun. Kind of the longer videos. Hopefully you guys like these slightly longer videos. All right, that seems like a wrap. Thank you guys.
See you, everyone.
Bye.